More than 30,000 Ukrainians found shelter in Estonia after Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. To put that in perspective, Estonia is a country of just over 1.3 million people, so that number hits differently. The support has been massive, both in terms of welcoming refugees and sending military aid. By proportion of its own stockpiles, Estonia is one of the most significant contributors to Ukraine's defense effort. And publicly, the backing for Ukraine here feels almost unanimous. Almost. Last summer, during Estonia's midsummer celebration, I ended up spending an evening with a group of 5 Ukrainians, all originally from Kherson, the southern city that had fallen under Russian control earlier in the war. What they shared with me that night quietly shattered a few assumptions I didn't even know I was holding. Let me back up and explain how we got there. Midsummer in Estonia is serious business. It follows the longest day of the year, and the entire country essentially migrates outdoors. People head into forests, gather by lakes, fire up grills, and stay up all night under a sky that barely gets dark. It's one of those traditions that feels ancient and alive at the same time. I ended up at one of these celebrations through my school friends, whose parents happened to work at the same factory as 2 of the Ukrainians in this group. There were 5 of them. Alexander and Emma, a couple in their early 50s, and their daughter Nastia, around 20 years old. With them were Nastia's boyfriend Anatoly, 22, and his younger sister Irina, who was 17. All 5 came from Kherson. Alexander had been the first to leave, back in 2014, eventually bringing the rest of the family over. Irina was the last to go, and unlike the others, she didn't leave before things got bad. She was still there when Russian forces rolled into the city. I asked questions carefully and kept things light. I didn't want to drag the evening into something heavy. But I managed to have real conversations, especially with Alexander. He works at a shipyard in Tallinn, painting hulls for international orders. He's a straight-talking, hard-working guy who doesn't dress things up. And his perspective was honestly the most jarring thing I encountered that whole summer, because I had gotten comfortable expecting a certain kind of answer from every Ukrainian I met. Alexander left Kherson in 2014, right after the political upheaval in Kiev. He'd left his family behind to find work and send money home. When I asked him what he thought of the Ukrainian government, he didn't hesitate. He said the people in charge now are no better than the ones who got pushed out back then. Corrupt then, corrupt now. In his view, regular people like him never win regardless of who holds power in the capital. He also told me he considered the events of 2014 in Kiev to be an illegal overthrow of a government. Not a revolution. A coup. And he said bluntly that what made sense to people in western Ukraine didn't necessarily translate to people in the east. When I asked whether the 2 halves of the country were genuinely different, he said yes, without blinking. He said people from the west coming into the east during that period only made things worse. On the question of language, Alexander said he believed Ukrainian authorities wanted to push Russian speakers out of public life. He didn't get into legal specifics, but he described working jobs in western Ukraine where locals would mock him for speaking Russian. Not debate him, not question him. Mock him. It left a mark. Now here's the part that really stuck with me. I asked him about support for Russia in Kherson, among the local population. He thought about it and said roughly half the city leaned toward Russia, with about a quarter being completely indifferent to the whole thing. He mentioned a cousin who was enthusiastically waving Russian flags the moment the troops arrived. Then he paused and said, almost with a laugh, that this cousin would fall in line with whoever let him get away with things. It wasn't ideological loyalty. It was opportunism. But Alexander himself didn't support Russia. He was clear on that. He said these kinds of disputes between countries don't need to be settled with weapons, and that the deaths piling up on both sides were entirely avoidable. He wasn't waving any flags. He wasn't cheering for Kiev either. He was somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, and he wasn't apologizing for it. His biggest fear, he told me, wasn't Russian occupation. It was a Ukrainian military offensive to recapture the city. Kherson fell without much of a fight. If it had to be taken back, that would mean artillery, airstrikes, urban combat. It would mean his city reduced to rubble and the people still living there caught in the middle of it. For Alexander, the question of which country the city officially belonged to was secondary to whether the people inside it survived. He also made an observation about generational differences that I've been thinking about ever since. He said support for Russia tends to rise with age. People who lived through the Soviet era carry a different frame of reference, a different sense of what normal looks like. His daughter Nastya, he said, was the complete opposite of him on this. Fiercely pro-Ukrainian, no ambivalence whatsoever. Younger people who grew up after the Soviet collapse have no nostalgia for that world and no patience for the arguments that come with it. The generational gap inside a single family, father and daughter, told the whole story. I didn't get much time with Nastya directly, which I regret. But I did talk with Anatoly for a while. He was surprised to find that some of his Estonian co-workers, particularly ethnic Russians who had lived in Estonia for decades, were openly sympathetic to Russia. He said it completely contradicted what he'd expected coming here. He thought Estonia would be uniformly opposed to the invasion. And mostly it is, but not entirely, and that gap confused and frustrated him. Anatoly also echoed something Alexander had said, which was that life in Kiev looked nothing like life in smaller Ukrainian cities. The capital's experience, its culture, its sense of national identity, didn't automatically represent the whole country. What people in Kherson were living through wasn't what people on television in Kiev were describing. Emma, Alexander's wife, stayed quiet through most of it but lit up when I explained a project I run called War Translated, which translates and contextualizes conflict-related content. Her reaction told me she was paying close attention to what was happening, more invested than she let on. She seemed to have made peace with life in Estonia, found comfort in its routines, but still held on to the idea of returning to Ukraine someday. And then there was Irina. On the drive to the midsummer location, we passed an open-air collection of old Soviet military vehicles put together by a local Estonian as a kind of informal museum. The owner wasn't there and the place was technically closed, but some of the equipment was visible outside and people went over to look at it. Anatoly and Alexander later told me that Irina refused to go anywhere near it. She walked the other way and waited. She had been in Kherson when Russian armored columns entered the city. She was 17 years old. The sound, the size, the weight of those machines moving through streets she recognized, it left something in her that a summer evening in Estonia hadn't healed yet. Old, rusting vehicles sitting in a field were enough to bring it back. I didn't push for more after that. The evening had its own rhythm and the people around us preferred lighter conversation, which was fair. But I kept returning to what Alexander had said about not wanting his city to be a battlefield again. There's a version of this war that gets narrated cleanly from a distance. Territory lost, territory reclaimed, front lines advancing and retreating. And in that version, liberation is always straightforwardly good. But Alexander reminded me that the city being liberated isn't empty. There are people inside it, people who've already lived through one takeover, who now have to calculate whether surviving a second round of violence is worth the flag that gets planted afterward. We've developed a habit of sorting people by which side they're on, as though every person in a conflict zone has the luxury of choosing one. But for a lot of people in places like Kherson and the Donbass, the choice that consumes every day is simpler and more urgent than geopolitics. It's about keeping their families fed, keeping their homes standing, and staying alive long enough to see what comes next. Alexander is not a rare case. There are millions of people in Ukraine who don't fit neatly into any of the categories we tend to use when talking about this war. For Ukrainian leadership, that reality matters. The goal can't just be military victory. It has to include making those millions of people feel like they belong to the country being fought for, regardless of what language they speak at home or what city they come from. If that part fails, the divisions that outside forces love to exploit will keep widening, and people like Alexander will keep feeling like they're strangers in their own story. That midsummer night ended the way those nights do, with a fire burning low and people drifting off as the pale sky finally started to darken. I didn't solve anything. I didn't change anyone's mind. But I listened, and sometimes that's the thing that needed to happen.